The Sad Truth About American Slave Breeding Farms is an article written by Henry Louis Gates, Jr., a historian and journalist who explores the history of slave breeding in the United States. Gates discusses the brutal reality of slave breeding farms and how slave owners and traders treated enslaved women as reproductive machines who could be exploited for their ability to produce children who could be sold for profit. Gates argues that slave breeding was a deliberate and systematic practice that was designed to increase the wealth of slave owners and traders by producing a steady supply of enslaved children who could be sold to other slave owners. Enslaved women were forced to bear children with male slaves who were selected for their physical attributes, such as strength or height, to produce children who would fetch a higher price in the slave market. Gates highlights the psychological trauma and physical abuse suffered by enslaved women who were subjected to this inhumane practice. Enslaved women were often separated from their children at an early age, and their bodies were subject to constant examination and scrutiny. They were also subjected to sexual violence, as male slaves were often forced to impregnate them. The legacy of slave breeding continues to affect Black Americans today, as it has contributed to a history of violence against Black bodies and a culture of systemic oppression. Gates argues that the dehumanization and exploitation of enslaved women on slave breeding farms is a key factor in the systemic racism that persists in American society today. Gates also discusses the role of the church in justifying and supporting slavery and slave breeding. Many churches in the South preached a message of racial hierarchy, arguing that Black people were inferior and that it was their duty to serve as slaves. This message was used to justify the brutal treatment of enslaved people, including the practice of slave breeding. The article concludes with a call to acknowledge and confront this dark chapter in American history, as a crucial step toward addressing racial inequality and achieving justice for all. Gates argues that by recognizing the legacy of slave breeding, we can begin to address the systemic racism that persists in American society today and work towards a more just and equitable future.